Next on Secrets of War. It was a battle no one really wanted, and a victory far greater than anyone expected. Israel, outnumbered and outgunned, fought the Six-Day War on the field of espionage. Secret agents gathered information vital to a daring first strike and crafted an ingenious plan to capture a Russian jet. Shadows of the Six-Day War is next on Secrets of War.
The eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea have been a bridge between continents for conquering armies since biblical times. Here at the crossroads of antiquity, on the same land where David slew Goliath, a short war was fought by a small nation surrounded by enemies. It was a 20th century showdown that took place between the 19-year-old state of Israel and nearly all its Arab neighbors. Neighbors who'd never accepted the 1947 United Nations partition plan of Palestine that had led to the creation of a Jewish state. Since 1948, this small country grew up in a constant state of war with the Arab states. Israeli leaders realized that superior intelligence would be the essential factor to overcome the Arabs' greater numbers in troops and weapons. Secret agents would work behind enemy lines to capture military hardware, pinpoint targets, and penetrate deep into the highest levels of foreign governments. In the background were the Cold Warring superpowers who were competing for supremacy in a region where East meets West. It was 1967, and the stage was set for a battle that would change the landscape of the Middle East forever. Along Israel's Mediterranean coast, near the metropolis of Tel Aviv, stands a unique monument to spies. It is known as the Memorial to Those in Intelligence, and like the world of intelligence, it is appropriately shaped like a maze. Engraved on its smooth walls are the names and dates of death of more than 400 men and women who gave their lives in the service of Israeli intelligence. Most of these names remain as mysterious and unyielding as the stone they are cut in. Like the rest of Israeli intelligence, the monument is a compromise between official secrecy and the need to honor those who lived and died for their country. In the 1960s, Israeli intelligence resided in the shadows. Even its very existence was officially denied. Of its two key agencies, Amman was responsible for army intelligence, while the Mossad was in charge of foreign intelligence. Together, they launched a series of operations that would determine Israel's fate against the combined military force of 5 Arab nations.
They definitely had the advantage of numbers. We didn't have any special qualitative edge. Our artillery and our aircraft and our naval boats, everything, were more or less similar to what the other side had. We made much more of an effort to have the right spies.
Israel's small budget for espionage activities did not reflect its success in intelligence gathering. According to Meir Amit, the Mossad chief at the time, his agency relied on HUMINT, or human intelligence, its people, as its most effective resource.
We were relying on human and not always on what you would call agents, which are paid, but many a time by people that we call them warriors, because they didn't come into the intelligence because of money, because of devotion, because of conviction, because they considered what they are doing as a mission.
Confronting Israel's northern border were the Arab states of Lebanon and Syria. To the east, the Kingdom of Jordan and the Republic of Iraq. To the west, the largest and most feared nation of the Arabic Empire, Egypt. While politically divided, the Arab states were united in their efforts to learn more about their common enemy. General Faiz Jaber of the Jordanian army worked in Jordanian military intelligence in 1967.
We were doing our work, in fact, gathering informations. Where are their positions? Where are their groupings? What is their intentions? You have to watch the ground, watching the ground reconnaissance, a little bit the borders.
Combined, the 5 Arab states totaled over 100 million people. Their leaders believed that 2.5 million Jews would be no match. Their overconfidence inspired a certain complacency within the ranks of Arab intelligence. For them, Israel was nothing more than a weak puppet state serving the interests of the West.
Arab intelligence in those days was suffering from something that is quite common, but is extremely dangerous. Wishful thinking according to your political mindset. And they simply refused to face reality.
The step-by-step escalation that culminated in 1967 began a decade earlier in 1956. 8 years after Israel survived its war for independence, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser seized control over the Suez Canal and blocked Israel's only port to the Red Sea. Israel launched a 4-day Suez campaign which broke the blockade and expelled the Egyptian army from the Sinai Peninsula. The United Nations brokered a truce. As the Israelis withdrew from Sinai, UN troops took over their positions, creating a buffer between Egypt and Israel. Nasser turned Israel's withdrawal into a victory for Egypt. Propaganda newsreels praised Egypt's successful military campaign. The Zionist enemy retreated from Sinai. Nasser enjoyed a complete political recovery. Privately, the Egyptian president rejected the UN truce. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union was committed to making its influence known in the Middle East. After standing down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, tension in the Middle East would help Moscow regain its battered image and counter America's growing hold on the region. Using Russian allies to confront Israel would be equivalent to confronting the imperialist United States itself. the Soviets began to supply advanced ready-made armaments like T-54 tanks and MiG jet fighters to its new Arab clients. Now facing an armory of Soviet weapons, Israel had to gain the upper hand with vital intelligence on the exact makeup and capabilities of its enemy's mysterious arsenal. To learn more, the Israeli Air Force under the command of General Mordechai Hod would occasionally provoke its neighbors into combat.
We learned by experience the behavior of the different type Russian equipment that the Arab Air Forces used before that war. We tested the way they react without them knowing that we're doing it by creating incidents just to see their behavior.
While minor border skirmishes heightened tensions, they also provided opportunities to measure enemy strength and abilities. Yet engagements were not enough. Appropriating a weapon intact would be the best way to understand just exactly what they were facing. Israeli intelligence needed to capture what no one in the West had ever seen before. Israel's biggest threat from the sky was the mysterious and advanced Soviet MiG-21 jet fighter. Even the United States, mired in the Vietnam War, was suffering losses from these deadly jets. The Pentagon recognized its strength in the air over Southeast Asia and hoped to study the Soviet-made warplane. From Tel Aviv, the Mossad launched Operation 007, a covert mission to capture, intact, a MiG-21. The intelligence agency concluded that its best chance was to persuade a pilot to actually fly his MiG-21 to Israel. The Iraqi Air Force was the chosen target.
It isn't so simple because you have to first know what's going on inside the Iraqi Air Force. You have to know who are the pilots, what are their attitudes to their own government, do they have reasons to be satisfied or not satisfied. That entails a tremendous amount of work just to get that particular piece of information.
A Mossad contact inside Iraq located a pilot, Munir Redfa, a deputy commander of a MiG-21 squadron who, as a Christian, felt persecuted. Redfa was met by a female agent who lured him to Europe. It was rumored to have been a romantic encounter. Redfa was offered $1 million and a safe haven for his family if he would deliver the MiG-21. He accepted and was secretly invited to Israel.
The Iraqi pilot was here before he bought the MiG-21. The Iraqi pilots flew with the chief of intelligence, who's the second guy who was in the plot, flew with him in a dual control jet to show him the state of Israel from up top, to make him aware how it does look.
Redfa slipped back into Iraq and returned to his airbase. Then, on the morning of the 16th of August, 1966, he set out on the pre-designated route to Israel in his MiG-21. It would be a 600-mile zigzag course over Jordan that avoided radar stations and air bases. After a 65-minute flight, he entered Israeli airspace.
Nobody knew. In the Air Force, two people knew, the chief intelligence and myself. And then I called this squadron commander. I didn't tell him what's going to happen. And when we caught him on the radar, I sent him to the air. And I told him, look, we have a MiG-21 coming in from the east. You are to intercept him, not to shoot him down. You are to intercept him and lower your wheels to show him that he should follow you.
The plane successfully landed on an airbase in Israel's desert. Redfa was met by his family, already in Israel, and all were swiftly taken into hiding. Israel had its reward. The sophisticated Soviet warplane had reached the West as it was seen here for the first time. In Washington, the CIA was informed that the United States would be able to examine a MiG-21 closely.
They were here less than 12 hours after he landed. The Americans were very, very excited because they never had a chance to have a flyable MiG-21 before that. This was the first one.
Every Israeli pilot trained in simulated combat against the MiG-21. As tensions grew in the Mideast, leaders of the Jewish state hoped this training would provide a decisive edge in any future conflict. In the mid-1960s, Israel was winning the intelligence war in the Middle East, penetrating deep into the Arab world. Not to be outdone, the Arab states struggled to maintain a balance in their efforts to spy across the border. While Israel successfully recruited agents to work behind enemy lines, the Arab states were limited in their ability to infiltrate Israeli society.
They did not succeed in recruiting agents in Israel. I think they were relying heavily on foreign people visiting the country, and foreign people don't really have very much access to the secrets.
Since Israel's independence, Syria had controlled the strategic Golan Heights along Israel's northern border. From the heights, Syrian guns fired on Israeli farmers working in the valley below. In the 1960s, Mossad agents were ordered to gather intelligence to pinpoint the locations of the Syrian gun emplacements. Mossad agent Eli Cohen breached the inner circle of the Arab world. As a Syrian-born Jew operating undercover as an Arab businessman, Cohen was accepted into the highest levels of the Syrian government. He was frequently invited to visit Syrian army bases and given a complete tour of the fortifications confronting Israel in the Golan Heights. With a photographic memory, Cohen was able to secretly radio back information on Syrian gun emplacements and troop deployments facing Israel to headquarters in Tel Aviv.
He had a lot of access to move all around, to see the Golan Heights, to see the Syrian units and formations. And he, all this time, sent a lot of excellent information about what happens in Syria. But in 1965, he unfortunately was catched and executed.
Captured while transmitting a message to the Mossad, Eli Cohen's tragic story was a disaster for the intelligence agency. Yet he provided Israeli intelligence with a remarkably complete picture of an enemy country that had once seemed impenetrable. By 1964, tension was escalating over one of the most precious resources in the Middle East: water. Israel had opened a national pipeline that brought water from the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee in the north down to the expanding settlements in the Negev Desert in the south. The sources for this water were tributaries that flowed from Syria and Jordan. When the Arab states united to divert this water source in 1965, Israel retaliated. The Arabs fought back with a new kind of weapon: terrorism. Palestinian refugees who'd been living in Arab countries formed a resistance movement to oppose Israel. Syrian military intelligence created a military wing for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. It was known as El Fatah.
In January 1965, El Fatah, that was created as a terrorist and guerrilla movement, they begin to increase their terrorist activity into Israel. Israel didn't find right way to tackle this problem.
By 1967, terrorist infiltrations into Israel from Syria were on the rise. Northern settlements were raided with acts of sabotage and murder. Tensions culminated on the 7th of April when Israel struck back using tanks, artillery, and aircraft penetrating Syrian territory. Capturing a MiG proved highly effective for the Israeli Air Force. At the end of a short battle, 6 MiG-21 fighters had been shot down, and at least 60 Syrian soldiers were dead. In Moscow, there was rising concern over the frequency of hostilities in the Middle East between its Soviet allies and Israel. After the brief battle with Israel that ended in Syrian defeat, Moscow was determined not to let the situation go unchallenged. The Mossad learned that a power struggle inside the Kremlin was causing a rift between the more moderate Soviet Premier Kosygin and his extremist party secretary Leonid Brezhnev. The results would dictate the future of Soviet foreign policy.
The motivation of the Soviet Union in 1967 was to establish or create an additional center of tension to Vietnam, because that was in the middle of the Cold War, and they knew that the Americans are stuck there up to their neck in Vietnam. We have evidence that 2 months before the war, Brezhnev told his colleagues that they are going to beat the Americans in the Middle East soon.
The Soviets hoped to make the Middle East another stage in the theater of the Cold War. To inflame an already tense situation, the KGB released a report that Israeli defense forces were mobilizing units along their northern border with Syria for a possible attack.
They spread disinformation and wrong information about Israel going to attack Syria, and there's a concentration of forces of 7 brigades on the Syrian border, etc., etc. Then they came to Egypt, and they say, you must assist the Syrians because the Israelis are going to attack them.
Egypt's President Nasser sent his deputy Anwar Sadat to Moscow. Sadat and his delegation met with Soviet leaders who informed them of the supposed buildup. They returned home convinced of an impending military offensive. Denials by Israel were not given a hearing. Even Russia's ambassador to Israel had made up his mind.
There was an interesting meeting between the Russian ambassador in Tel Aviv, in Israel, with Eshkol, our prime minister, who came to warn Eshkol, our prime minister, why are you concentrating forces? And Eshkol said, there are no forces. General Amit, I was present there, can accompany you to Syria, to the north, and you can find for yourself if there are any concentrations. So, no, I don't want to go.
Soviet intelligence predicted that both Israel and the Arabs would stop short of actual war. But what began as an intentional deception would evolve into a grave miscalculation. The countdown to the ultimate battle was about to begin. In April 1967, as the Soviet Union confronted its Cold War adversary, the United States, it was unwittingly pushing the Middle East to the brink of war.
Nobody at that time was ready for war. But when things began about the grouping forces of the Israelis on the Syrian sector, and the Russian government, it tried to show the world that there is a very, very short attack will come against Syria, in fact, and against the Arab world, we began to realize that there is a war. And psychologically, we began to prepare for war.
Nasser responded to the Soviet warning. The Egyptian president, who never accepted the settlement of the 1956 campaign that demilitarized the Sinai, now raised the ante. He was about to embark on a path of no return that would catch the Israeli intelligence community completely off guard. The rumor put out by the Soviet Union had now escalated, causing the Egyptian military to take up positions in the Sinai Peninsula. Nasser then demanded that United Nations personnel in the Sinai be confined to their bases. The UN General Secretary U Thant insisted that his troops hold their positions or depart Sinai altogether. Nasser stuck to his ultimatum, forcing the evacuation of the entire UN force from the peninsula. The Israelis went on the alert. With 6 full Egyptian army units deployed in defensive positions in the Sinai, Israel called up its army reserves. Yet Israeli intelligence believed that Nasser's moves did not mean a war was imminent. The Egyptian leader was consolidating his power in hopes of leading an empire of Arab nations, but most were not quite ready to accept his authority.
I never think that Nasser was in his heart believing that there would be a war. But his motives was to make an empire, Arabic empire. In fact, we don't want to tailor this empire according to his ways or moves, you see. We need to have an Arabic empire. We need to have one Arabic state, in fact, but not according to the ways and means he wants to do it, Nasser himself.
On the morning of the 23rd of May, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was awakened with the news that Egypt had closed the Straits of Tiran at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula to all Israeli shipping. Just as in the action that precipitated the 1956 war, Israel's naval passage to its vital southern port of Eilat was blocked.
Israel, in Nasser's eyes, and this we know from intelligence material, Nasser thought Israel was in a weak situation, and that therefore by bullying and by threatening and by moving troops, Israel would recoil, and he didn't think that he would have a problem with Israel. It was completely mistaken intelligence on the part of the Egyptians.
Supported by their intelligence reports, the men around Israeli Chief of Staff General Yitzhak Rabin were convinced that Israel could launch a successful first strike against Nasser's army. Rabin began to pressure the hesitating Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. His recommendation was direct. The time to go to war was now.
All IDF mobilized the forces, but the government didn't give any, let's say, green light to the army to do something more than this, because they sent the foreign minister, Abba Eban, abroad to try to arrange a diplomatic solution.
Abba Eban presented Israel's case before the United Nations. The 3 Western powers and the Security Council made frantic efforts to alleviate the crisis at the last moment. Egypt was urged to make a compromise, but Nasser, convinced of Israel's weakness, would not yield. In Washington, President Lyndon Johnson sent a message to the Israeli Prime Minister. The U.S. proposed to open the straits with an international task force, and Johnson urged Eshkol to delay a first strike. The American Sixth Fleet and British destroyers, shadowed by Soviet warships, a total of over 70 vessels in all, entered the eastern Mediterranean, compounding an already tense atmosphere. Sailing with them was a mysterious U.S. naval vessel outfitted with top-secret intelligence-gathering equipment. Operating for the National Security Agency, it was known as the USS Liberty. On the 30th of May, a reluctant King Hussein of Jordan joined in a defense pact with Egypt. The Jordanian army was now placed under Egyptian command, and 2 Egyptian battalions were moving into Jordan. Jordanian diplomatic relations with Syria were renewed and strengthened. It was now evident that Israel would not be fighting a minor skirmish. This would be a three-border war.
Before the break of the war, we had a treaty with Egypt, about a month before. How would it work, a treaty before the war? It needs month and month to coordinate, to mingle the two armies, to understand each other. The Egyptian army was working according to the Russian school. We have our units, we have our ways and means to how to fight, you see. So there was less of coordination.
Confusion within the ranks of the Arab armies was overshadowed by loud calls for Israel's destruction throughout the Arab capitals. While the saber-rattling grew more intense, the Israeli army remained mobilized but inactive. Intelligence warned that with each passing day of inaction, Israel was showing signs of weakness in the eyes of its Arab neighbors. Eshkol needed to know the status of the international task force to open the straits. He dispatched Mossad chief Meir Amit to Washington, where he met with his American counterpart and friend Richard Helms, director of the CIA.
So Dick told me, look, I'll tell you the truth. There's no task force, no naval forces. We couldn't assemble them.
Faced with the prospect of returning home without an American response to the crisis, Amit requested a meeting with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to explain Israel's position.
And I told him we don't want external intervention, neither on your part nor on the Russian part. Then he said, I read you loud and clear. And I asked him, Mr. Secretary, what do you think should I do? Should I stay for another day or sometime here? He said, no, you go back home.
I would not say that Washington gave the Israelis the green light, but they didn't object to what the Israelis told them would be the next step if the Egyptians continue to keep their troops on the frontiers and if the Egyptians continue to blockade the straits.
In the end, the United States understood Israel's reasoning and indicated by its silence that it did not oppose an Israeli first strike. Amit traveled back to Jerusalem. In a late-night meeting at the Prime Minister's residence, he reported on his trip and recommended war. In a meeting on the 4th of June, Eshkol's cabinet voted to attack. The fate of Israel was now in the hands of the army. An entire Israeli generation of 264,000 men would be facing an imposing United Arab Army of 540,000 soldiers. In heavy weaponry and aircraft, Israel was outnumbered 3-1. On the following morning of the 5th of June, a daring first strike would be launched. With the code words Sadi Adom, red sheet, the attack would begin. As the sun broke on the morning of the 5th of June, 1967, Israeli pilots began what they thought would be another ordinary day until they were issued target sheets. It was the first time they learned of Operation Moked, the plan to attack Egyptian air bases. The preemptive airstrike was designed to give Israel complete control of the airspace. Nearly the entire Israeli Air Force took off, flying low over the Mediterranean. In less than an hour, they would be making military history.
The big question mark was, could we get there and in surprise? 45 minutes, the longest 45 minutes of my life. 200 airplanes flying, radio silence on the ground. Nobody's talking, nobody knows if they're okay or not. We knew that if we will surprise them and they will not discover that we are on the way to the targets, then after that, it will take the Egyptian Air Force at least half an hour to understand what happened.
Israeli spies like Agent Wolfgang Lotz operated undercover inside Egypt and befriended many senior Egyptian army officials. Through their eavesdropping, they were able to pinpoint exactly when the Egyptian Air Force, its pilots, officers, and equipment would be most vulnerable. Between 7:30 and 8 in the morning. As a result, one agent reportedly entertained some Egyptian army officers the night before, keeping them up into the early hours on the morning of the attack.
We have chosen the time of attack in accordance to what we knew is when are the Egyptian army officers and Air Force pilots driving their cars on their way to their units.
The exact time had been set. The airstrike would commence at 7:45 a.m. after Egypt's morning air patrols had completed their rounds.
7:45 was after the first light patrol, Egyptian patrol, is already landed. Every morning, first light, they patrol because the world thought first light is the time to start a war. And they saw first light, nothing happens, they landed. They landed, we came.
Egyptian pilots on airfields all across the Sinai scrambled out of their barracks to find their planes on fire and exploding all around them. The Israelis destroyed a total of 419 aircraft, 90% of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground.
We kept it a secret. Not one single word telling about the achievement of our Air Force. And we wanted to gain time. We preferred the Israeli public opinion to go on being in panic. And in order to make sure that the world doesn't know the result. To the best of my knowledge, not even Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president in those days, did really know what happened to his Air Force at that time.
In fact, it took 6 hours for the Egyptians, Jordanians, and Syrians to understand what had happened and to react. Meanwhile, General Hod trained his pilots on the Syrian and Jordanian airfields, destroying Arab planes before they could strike Israel's cities. By 2:30 p.m. on the first day of fighting, Israel had successfully dominated the skies over the entire theater of war. On the same day, 3 Israeli tank columns penetrated the Sinai Desert. Israeli intelligence received invaluable detailed information on Egyptian troop strengths, movements, battle plans, and even morale from agents working behind enemy lines and within the Egyptian army.
Intelligence provided all details. We knew where are they, where they are deployed, how they are, what kind of obstacles, what kind of fortifications they had prepared. We knew everything. And in my briefing to my troops, I told them that we are facing big army formations. The side that will win this first battle will win the war.
Intelligence on exact Egyptian positions provided for a successful charge by Israeli forces into Sinai. More than 1,000 tanks engaged in the largest battle the Sinai Desert had ever seen. Over the next 48 hours, Egyptian forces would begin to retreat westward towards the Suez Canal. To the east, Israel's border with Jordan went along the west bank of the Jordan River and divided the city of Jerusalem in half. An Israeli agent dispatched through Jerusalem informed Jordan's King Hussein that Israel would not enter into hostile actions against Jordan if the king refrained from attacking Israel. Despite Israel's diplomatic offer, Hussein had issued the order to attack, and the Jordanian legion opened fire. Both sides gave divided Jerusalem strategic priority. The fighting raged throughout the entire region and all around the walled city. Under his military pact with Nasser, Hussein called for Egyptian air support. Nasser still had not publicly acknowledged the destruction of his own air force.
There were no cover from the air, no planes at all. And we knew at last that the planes of Egypt, which we promised that they will be coming to help us, they were completely damaged or destroyed on the ground. But the king was obliged by himself to fight. I have to fight it, whatever might be the price of this war. Even if I lose my regime, I will fight it with my brothers, the Arabs. So he fought it like that. And we lost the West Bank. We lost it easily.
As an Israeli column penetrated the old city walls of Jerusalem, General Mordechai Gur proclaimed over the radio, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." For the first time in 2,000 years, the Jews completely controlled their holiest site, the western wall of Solomon's ancient temple. King Hussein had lost the West Bank, all of Jerusalem, and the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's most treasured shrines. By the evening of the 7th of June, Israel and Jordan agreed to a UN ceasefire. As the war quickly turned in Israel's favor, cheers for the Jewish state were growing louder. The world loves an underdog. Like no other time in history, Israel was basking in a glow of public support. Nowhere was this more clearly felt than in the United States.
The Israelis were so clever to show the world that all the world is standing beside them. Even the United States is standing beside them. Britain is standing beside them. They were clever to show the world that we are alone, the Arabs.
On the 8th of June, Israeli troops advanced and reached the Suez Canal at 4 points. The waterways of the Straits of Tiran were reopened. Israel and Egypt held their fire. All of the Sinai was now in Israeli hands. As Israel celebrated victory over one of its greatest enemies, that same day was marred by a tragedy involving one of its greatest friends. The U.S. had become involved in the war when, on the morning of 8th of June, the USS Liberty was quietly sailing under an American flag in international waters off the Sinai coast.
Unfortunately, we had intelligence information at the time that Egyptians might be trying naval landing of their forces behind our lines on the coastline in Sinai. And the first indication that there is an unidentified vessel there was interpreted as that possible Egyptian boat.
Israeli planes and torpedo boats set out to attack the American reconnaissance ship. They later claimed attempts had been made to learn its identity.
They then twice called the American embassy, which of course knew of no U.S. Navy ships off the coast. Reason being, the ship was controlled by NSA, the National Security Agency, which does communications intercepts, and not by the Navy.
The attack began first by Israeli jet fighters, followed by a naval torpedo attack.
Meanwhile, another airstrike was being prepared, but by this time the PT boats had seen the code letters on the ship, GTR-5, which they realized was not an Arabic designation, but an English language designation. By that time, the Israelis began to believe they had made a mistake.
At the end of the day, 34 of the Liberty's sailors were dead, many others wounded. Israel apologized for the incident and offered compensation to the families of the dead, but never adequately explained the attack. While an official U.S. inquiry reported the assault was a mistake, many survivors from the Liberty crew remained convinced that the Israelis deliberately attacked the ship. They insist that Israel intended to keep all nations, even its allies, from learning of its military plans. The truth may never be revealed. The Syrian-Israeli front fully ignited on the 9th of June. The Israeli Air Force successfully bombed strategic Syrian gun emplacements thanks to detailed information supplied by the executed spy master, Eli Cohen, and other agents of the Mossad. The Israeli ground assault was extremely difficult. Units faced steep approaches to the Golan Heights against heavily fortified Syrian positions. But by the end of the day, the Israelis had taken control of the heights, and the guns threatening the settlements below were silenced. Fighting continued into the next day, pushing the Syrians back even farther east. When Israel and Syria agreed on a ceasefire on the evening of the 10th of June, Israeli troops stood on the doorstep of Damascus, the Syrian capital. After 6 days, the war was over. On the 7th day, Israelis awoke to the realities of a new Middle East. They had captured the ever-threatening Golan Heights to the north, East Jerusalem, the West Bank to the Jordan River in the east, and the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula to the south. The conquered area alone was more than 3 times the size of Israel before the war. The Israelis were unprepared for the consequences of their victory, including the occupation of nearly 1 million Palestinians, a problem which remains unsolved after many decades. The Arab nations were also unprepared, not just for the war, but for the price of their defeat.
The intelligence never made any sort of impact or advantage to the war at 1967. If I want to blame somebody, we blame ourselves. We were never convinced of this war, and we lost the most precious city in the world to us as Muslims and Arabs, Jerusalem.
Their way of operation at the time was, don't confuse me with facts. Our mind is made up.
Never again would Israel's future successes be quite as distinct as they were in the Six-Day War. The overwhelming victory by Israeli intelligence confirmed the Arabs' underestimation of the other side. For Arab intelligence, the Six-Day War was a miscalculation that could not be repeated.
All of a sudden, they had a very different estimate and evaluation about our capabilities and about how they should prepare themselves for war.
The Middle East had changed. The Arab states would no longer take Israel for granted, making future conflicts much more challenging for Israeli intelligence. In Israel, the price of each victory can be measured by the success of its intelligence. The role of intelligence in the Six-Day War may always be remembered as its greatest triumph.
We did it for years, collected the information. That was our main objective, to have the real picture of the strength and the might and the ability of our neighbors. Intelligence work is it's not Matahari, nice girls, and things like that, zippers. It is a very, very dull, continuous operation. It's a puzzle.
Like no other country on earth, Israel has to rely on secret intelligence for its survival. The monument to Israel's spies stands as a silent reminder of the quiet work of unknown soldiers. Most notable are those secret heroes who collected vital information in the shadows of the Six-Day War.